Hello, this is Wade Frazier. Uh, this is January 21st, 2026. This post, actually, the next few posts probably are going to be about my days with Dennis in Ventura, California, my hometown. This will take a few posts. It should be worth it because what happened in Ventura is the biggest takedown of a free energy effort in history, as far as I know. This was the big one, and and the story has rarely been told. Dennis had a book about it, but mostly the media and even people in the free energy field lie about what happened. And so I'm here to give my perspective on it, which will be richly documented and sourced. But I'm also going to be there's so much to tell, so much to tell, and so uh, this will at least this series of videos will make a pretty good dent in relaying the story of what happened. As I mentioned in my previous post, uh, I didn't know why we were moving to Ventura, where I was raised. That was the last place on earth that I wanted to be. So I had left Southern California twice previously, intending to never return to live in Southern California. And then there I was driving a truck across the United States to California. And this is where, the voice in my head, I call them my friends. And my life is full of paranormal events and preposterous events that are like so far beyond coincidence that it's ludicrous. Yeah, my life's been full of that. And so it's just, and I've accepted that much of my life is dealing with what my friends throw at me. That's been my journey. And so it's hasn't been easy, hasn't been fun. I like to think it's for a good cause, but yeah, I could have had a very different life if I wasn't listening to that voice in my head. And my friends were being active and throwing events at me. Just before we left Boston, we actually hired a guy to run the Boston operation, such as it was. And he soon tried to steal it, which is, again, and we'll get to this more, but it's normal. By that time, that was like, I don't know, fourth or fifth attempt I had seen of people trying to steal our operation. In Seattle, I saw it a few times. The last one was successful. And we had that one in Boston. And Dennis actually brought in one of his childhood friends from Yakima, where Dennis was from, Yakima, Washington, to oversee it. So he came out to Boston. He sort of ran the operation, quickly ran it into the ground, spent amazing amounts of money on himself, and I think his wife. It was like a big vacation for him. And then at the end of it, he took the car for that family that took in Dennis and me. They had leased a car and he was driving it. And then he just took the car and he drove it home to Yakima without even, no asking anybody. He just drove the car to Yakima. So actually, Dennis had his sister who lived in Yakima. I think he mailed her the key. She went to the guy's house and stole it back and took it to her house. And Dennis flew me up to Seattle. I somehow I got over to Yakima and then got the car and then drove the car down to California. Dennis's Seattle salesman, one that's from Boston, he flew out from Boston to pick the car up and drive it back across the continent. And that was typical of the chaos that was in those days. Yeah, all sorts of chaotic events like that as just came with the territory. That was a sampling. That was a sampling of the kind of what it was. In fact, that guy who did that, Dennis brought him down to Ventura like a month later to be his sidekick, sales sidekick. He was a fast-talking salesman. That's why Dennis liked him. It was a childhood friend, I guess, and also a fast-talking aluminum siding salesman. I'm not sure he was that good at it, but he was Dennis's friend. So anyway, so he was part of the Ventura operation early on. And Dennis's background was sales, and he only got involved with technology and stuff kind because he had to. His whole deal was trying to find somebody who could build and install them as fast as he could sell them. That was like with the heat pump. That was his program, but he had to do it all himself because nobody else could deliver. So Dennis was a guy improving the technology, building a factory, all this kind of stuff. When Dennis rather have just sold and marketed rather than being on the other end of it. But necessity dictated that Dennis got involved in those areas, and his genius came to bear quite a bit in many areas. When I was driving the truck to California, in fact, we had stopped at Amway headquarters in Ada, Michigan, and they tested our heat pump. They were looking like they were getting involved with Dennis's heat pump, and that salesman, that same salesman, he was actually became sort of our tech out there, but he didn't know what he was doing. It was actually he was called liquid charge the compressor. And he broke it, so he broke the heat pump that got tested, so it didn't have those high COPs, and so Amway declined getting involved, which actually relieved Dennis because he really didn't want to get involved with a big corporation like Amway, and he'd lose his freedom, particularly when he was talking up free energy. And then from Michigan, Dennis actually went home. So he went home. In fact, Stan, the engineer, came with us. In fact, he went back to Ellensburg, where he was from, lived. And Dennis went to Yakima, and his father was dying. So Dennis's father was dying of rheumatoid arthritis, complications of it at that time. And he was only 60, 61, something like that. Pretty young, pretty young. And he died of rheumatoid arthritis, and Dennis was there. So Dennis was there and actually said his goodbyes. And then in late July, as I recall, of 1987, Dennis and his family came down to Ventura for the next chapter. And Wayne, my professor, my best professor ever, again, Wayne was going to be a region. Dennis had his program of regional. He cut the United States into 10 regions, and Wayne wanted the West Coast. And so Wayne was raising money. And so when we hit, when Dennis showed up, in fact, when I got there, my father and I actually unloaded the truck and put it into a storage facility there in Ventura. So all of our assets were in a storage facility. And then when Dennis showed up, Wayne gave Dennis $40,000 that he had raised and just gave it to him and said, "Here, Dennis, here you go." And Dennis, after he did that, Dennis said, "Wait, you got any more guys like Wayne?" Because Dennis had never, what Wayne and I had done, he had never experienced that before. He had never experienced investors and partners who would just give him the money to watch him go. Yeah, all the other times they were trying to control him, they're stealing from him, all these kinds of things. Yeah, so he had never experienced investors like Wayne and I before, and he wouldn't since. Yeah, we were unique in his experience. Um, so Dennis and his wife and children, they rented a home uh, uh, close by. So where I was raised in Ventura, and there was a county center which will figure in this story as it goes along. So there was a county center that was built fairly new. In fact, Gary Ween, my cop friend, said it was built by defrauding the public because a bunch of judges and others really cleaned up. A lot of fraud and grift went behind building that county center, as usual. Uh, and that county center was also like 3 miles from where I was raised, and where the house we rented was maybe a half mile from the county center. Where Wayne lived was a mile from the county center. Wayne lived about a mile from the college, and the college where I went, I literally my first job was across the street at this this older folks retirement home. And my first girlfriend lived about a block from that. In fact, the one I eventually married lived about a block from that. Um, Literally, all this happened within a few mile radius. Yeah, you drive to any in 10 minutes. You could drive to any one of these points: Wayne's house, my house, our office, all these things. So it was yeah, it was my hometown where I was raised. So just a second. When I got there in Ventura, I actually lived with my father and his second wife for about a month. Then they kicked me out. I was they were used to living by themselves, and so they didn't want any of their kids coming back home. Um, so I moved back in with Dennis's family. So actually, they kicked me out about the same time Dennis moved in with his family. So we rented a house. Of course, there's furnished from the thrift store. Yeah, Dennis and his wife, they always lived with thrift stores and Goodwill clothes and all this. That was their life. Yeah, people would always allege that Dennis had stolen millions and all this kind of stuff. And anybody who says that has no idea what they're talking about. And yeah, and I saw this stuff kind of come up repeatedly from Seattle onward. People would always say, "Oh, Dennis was absconded with millions of dollars, etc." Yeah, they weren't there watching him get his clothes from the Goodwill and his furniture from the thrift stores. So Wayne So my professor Wayne was a partner in a CPA firm also. Not only was he a professor at the local college, he was a partner in a CPA firm. And during tax season, which is the winter months, between teaching and tax returns, he'd work about 70 hours a week. And Wayne was the most beloved professor at that college. When he was on campus, he actually gave free tax advice to any faculty who asked. That was his rule. As a professor, he changed lives. And so I've seen, I could tell story after story about Wayne. He was a saint. Wayne was a saint. And so, yeah, everybody loved Wayne. He was a pillar of the community. He also had adult onset diabetes, and but he was an amazing physical specimen. So when we moved there, I was 29. Wayne was 52. And I was a track star in college, and I could have been a bench warmer on my high school basketball team. And Wayne thought I actually could have played for the college team. Have my doubts about that, but Wayne actually was an expert. He was an expert in this stuff. Anyway, Wayne played basketball with me when we got there. One-on-one, we'd play, and he actually was competitive. I mean, Wayne actually, I don't think he ever won, but he was a competitive basketball player at 52 years old. I stopped playing basketball when I was about late 30s, and I stopped running, jumping, throwing, playing basketball, all stuff. But before I was 40, I had stopped doing all that. It was too dangerous. I didn't want to jeopardize my hiking career by wrecking my body playing sports. That Wayne could do that at 52, I look back at that and it's just in awe that he could do that at age 52. I mean, that'll become relevant later. That's why I bring this up. And Wayne also had the keys to the gymnasium. So the gymnasium I played at, yeah, I mean, literally the same place I played when I was in college, or I was, 10 years later, playing the same court. Couldn't dunk a basketball any longer, but I could still play. And and Wayne was right there with me. I'm still amazed by that. And Wayne had an office, so it's a few blocks. So the house that I lived in with Dennis, Wayne, getting back to his tax practice, he actually had an office that was just a few blocks from our house. And Dennis, when we hit town, when Dennis came down, this is now end of July, as I recall. So end of July, Dennis showed up, and Dennis is again sales oriented. So he ran an ad for salesmen. And he also tried training me. He trained me to initially screen interviews with the people who answered the ad for salesmen. I think it was the first ad he ran that was not the local paper. It was the LA Times. So he ran LA Times. And Dennis's ads they weren't big ads. They were pretty small ads, but it's free electricity, looking for salesmen, this kind of thing. And so, anyway, we were working. Again, Dennis and I were working in Wayne's office one evening after Dennis had only been in town, a couple of weeks. And Dennis was calling back responses to the ad that he ran in LA Times for salesmen. And I'm going to regress here a little bit to give a little background for this event, which was a significant event for me. Dennis, years later, I told Dennis about this, and he didn't even remember the call, but I sure did. And so to back up, so again, my mentor, anybody who uses a cell phone today, they're using my mentor's technology. In the 1960s, he invented the circuit that would charge batteries, but wouldn't allow them to overcharge. And that's a long, interesting story behind that for the U.S. Navy. It was unmanned Soviet listening stations in the Pacific Ocean that had to be, run on their own. He invented it for that application, but ended up being stolen actually by a guy who worked at Lockheed. And then he became the electronics design man of the year for this invention. And actually, my mentor tried to get the Navy to prosecute the guy, but he was a military, he worked for Lockheed, and so nothing happened. And this is the real world of inventing. Yeah, so all my mentor's inventions were stolen or suppressed, or both, which I'm going to get to here. And so, that circuit was the most used of his inventions, but the one that became the most famous, especially associated with his name, was the engine that he invented. And this engine began making the news back in 1974. And 1974 really started making the news. He invented it in 68. His first patent was, I think, in the early 70s. Then the government got involved. And the second patent, the government actually claimed, you can see the government claimed rights to it because they spent a lot of money developing the second patent. They spent a man years of development in developing this patent. And that meant that they could build it without paying any royalties. And in fact, about the same time that was making the news, the Senator John Tunney called my mentor at home because a federal study in the wake of this is now 1974, I believe, 75, somewhere in there. The federal study concluded it was the best engine in the world for powering an automobile. Just a second. So this federal study concluded that my mentor's engine was the best in the world for powering an automobile by a huge margin over anything else. So it was the best engine in the world. In fact, Senator John Tunney, in fact, that was Gene Tunney, the prizefighter's son. In fact, the movie The Candidate, with starring Robert Redford, was actually a fictionalized version of Tunney. Anyway, so Tunney became the alternative energy senator during the oil crisis, 73, 74. And he called my mentor at home a couple of times to try to get congressional hearings to get his engine built, to promote it in Congress, to get a national effort to do this, to build it. And my mentor, he declined. He declined the invitations. One of which, this is inventors, one of which was that he would forego his commercial rights if they did that. So he wasn't willing to forego his commercial rights. He wanted to make something off it. But also, when it was making the news, at some meeting, some high-ranking military official said, if you think your engine is going to make Detroit's internal combustion engine obsolete, make your funeral plans now. And I didn't hear that until many years later, but that was one of the sobering comments that people in the know would make around stuff like this. That, yeah, if you think you're going to, make some big industry in the United States obsolete, think again, because they will kill you, which I came to learn is so very true. And so the rocket scientist, in fact, he died, so I've named him. I write about him. Owen Dykema. He was a rocket scientist. Actually helped save the space program. He's actually the guy who figured out why all those rockets were blowing up when they were launching, and it had to do with inconsistent combustion. And in fact, when my father worked at NASA, he had heard of this guy's work. And this guy actually became the biggest champion of that engine. And that engine, again, it was making waves. And at one point, an industrialist, I believe, an LA industrialist, offered to found a car company based on that engine. And so this guy was going to say, yes, we're going to build cars based on this engine. And the industrialist, and this is, I guess, I heard this is kind of the standard, is that he said, okay, I'm going to found this company, and my mentor and Owen would be the technical brains behind it. And the industrialist would own 95% of the company, and my mentor and Owen would split the other 5%. And with a deal like that, they declined. They said, okay, not really. We're not interested. That's what they did. Anyway, so a couple years after that, in the Rose Parade, somebody had built my mentor's engine in a car, and they drove it in the Rose Parade. And they announced, I heard this from my mentor, and so they announced that this is going to revolutionize the automobile industry, et cetera. And yeah, so I'm pretty certain it was that industrialist, some related to industrialist to him himself who did that. So they were just stealing it then. So if the inventor wouldn't play along, they just take it, which I've come to learn is typical. So, and that was the end of it. So I heard about this back in the 70s. I had heard this stuff. And so, and again, this is in July, I think, probably late July, early August of 87. So this is probably 10 years after that Rose Parade, some number like that. Dennis is responding to ads. Again, he's calling back respondents to his ad for salesmen for free electricity. And I was working in the office too, so I was doing something, at another desk. And Dennis gets, and anyway, I'm working, and Dennis is calling, he's talking, and he hangs up the phone. And he looks over at me, and he tells me the conversation that he just had. And what it was the respondent, guy who called up, and Dennis calls him, and the guy, he said, I'm not interested in the job. I just want to talk to whoever's crazy enough to advertise free electricity. And this guy proceeded to tell Dennis this story. And he said, in fact, to back up a little bit, so my mentor's engine, I see numbers like 100 miles per gallon thrown around. In fact, he told me that for a mail truck, which wouldn't go very fast, always starting and stopping a lot, just drive around neighborhoods. He said that it would probably get 200 miles a gallon. These are the numbers I had heard, again, 50 years ago. And anyway, so this guy who called Dennis said that he worked for a company that was building an automobile there in LA that got 100 miles a gallon. I'm sure there weren't too many companies like that. So my guess is this was the company that was stealing my mentor's engine. And so he proceeded to tell Dennis, he said, okay, so he was the head of marketing. He said, I was the head of marketing for this company. And well, the company's not around anymore. In fact, the owners, the founders, are all in prison. And he said they were in prison because there was a trial. They were prosecuted for fraud. That, of course, nobody could make cars get 100 miles a gallon or whatever. And they were prosecuted for fraud. And they all went to prison. And the man said at the trial, the chief witness for the prosecution was this guy who said he was their chief engineer. And he testified in detail to the fraudulent practices of his company. But the problem was nobody at the company had ever seen this guy before. And he said that forged payroll records were introduced into evidence to prove this man works at the company. Yeah. So, and obviously the prosecution was in on it, right? So yeah, this is a general preview of what I would be living through the next year. And so, and this guy, he said to Dennis, he said, you don't know what they'll do to you. these are evil people, and they will take you out. And Dennis said, well, I'm sure you called me because you wanted to find somebody who had the guts to do this. So anyway, so I'm going to do it. So, and that was the end of that call. Less than a year later, Dennis was in jail with $1 million bail after declining the CIA's $1 billion offer to full operation. So I'm pretty sure that I heard about the fate of the company that stole my mentor's engine. A bigger predator took them out. So this was an instance where his invention was not only stolen, but the thieves got suppressed. So yeah, that was an amazing moment for me to hear that. So let's see what I'm doing next. Just a second. So we soon rented a building, which was again another less than a mile from Dennis's house. Was a building that we rented, and it was an office. It was a, I don't know, maybe 5,000 square feet, maybe something like that. But it had offices in front and a warehouse in the back. A typical kind of industrial, but not very large. And the as I mentioned in a previous post, the only person in Massachusetts who got involved with us was a machinist, and he came out and he eventually became our machinist there. And so we actually built a machine shop in that warehouse there in the back. We built a machine shop, which is, and in the next post, I'll go into that in some detail. And so we had that facility, and we only had a handful of volunteers. And Dennis and Allison, again, thrift stores, etc. So I watched them in action. So they would go, they went to some local furniture store, a local merchant, but you can get them to negotiate. So Dennis and Allison would sort of play tag team. I called it going skinning, and they would negotiate buying all this office furniture for our facility. And so they did that, and yeah, Dennis was pretty excited about what we were doing. But at that point, all I'd seen was bloody ruin. This is now about 17 months, and I hadn't seen anything happen yet, really, not too much. It was a brief high when we did our greatest energy shows. It was a struggle after that, and it really wasn't happening. I had heard plenty about what Dennis had built in Seattle and other things, and it was like I missed that show, and I wanted to see that show. It was coming. So about that time, this is now early August probably of 1987. Actually, Dennis came down deathly ill. I think it was kidneys. He was deathly ill. And again, his father died of rheumatoid arthritis. Dennis, again, was paralyzed from the neck down with Guillain-Barré. He had immune system problems, autoimmune stuff. And so anyway, his kidneys were like, I think it was his kidney. And so he was in agony. And again, we didn't, Dennis, when he was paralyzed, he actually, they went to a VA because he was a Vietnam veteran. And I think that's what if he was sick enough, he'd go to a VA facility. But at that point, there wasn't one close. And anyway, he was really came down super sick. And one evening, he was lying on in our dining room, lying on the floor, groaning in agony. And I've talked a little bit about my background with my paranormal experiences and mystical stuff, and I started to become a hands-on psychic healer, and I've done a bit of that, and sometimes miraculously, successfully, but quite often, unfortunately or fortunately, I would be dealing with people who are on death's doorstep, and when it was like that, usually they died immediately after I worked on them psychically. just, it's like, and even not even the same room, but meditating, let's say. And my understanding is that when on death's doorstep, when you do that kind of work, actually they will die quickly quite often because it's their time. And so, but it helps them transition easier. But how to say it? That was not easy for me to deal with that, where people were dying immediately after I worked on them. So I didn't do it much. Anyway, so then, but there was Dennis lying there, in agony. I don't think he was conscious. He was just groaning, and he was the company. Dennis was the engine that made it all work. And so here I was. Man, I love him like a brother. We're closer in family. But the thing there was lying there, and he was our only ass. He made the company work, and he was like dying there on the dining room floor. So I went over and did a really intense hands-on healing session with him. I don't think he knew it, so I don't have to touch him. You be close. You're doing this energy work, and so I did this really intense energy work with Dennis, just praying with all my might that this was he could heal, and he miraculously healed. About a day or two later, it was all over. In fact, he eventually did go to a doctor, and the doctor said, "You had something bad, but you miraculously have healed." So they could tell the remnants of it or something. They said, "Yeah, you had some terrible condition that somehow just vanished." So, and when you're doing stuff like that, I could never take the credit for that stuff. When people who are good healers, they realize that it's coming through them. It's not from them; it's through them. So you're just channeling higher powers when you're doing something like that. And love is the answer. That love is what makes it all work. So Dennis and I had that kind of connection, I guess, that it worked and saved the business. So the thing where, okay, here was our prime mover. Around the same time that Dennis got sick. And again, he ran ads. So again, this is he comes to town, runs ads for salesmen. But he tried something different. And this was, I believe, in early August, late July of 87. And what he did was he ran an ad in USA Today. And again, only these small ads, only like this big, right? Like an inch tall and an inch and 2 inches wide or something. And the title and the heading was "Free Electricity." But Dennis wasn't selling free electricity. He also said, "Okay, we're gonna sell you information kits on how to build and sell and install the world's best heating system." And there's information, and this is documentation from Dennis's businesses. And so it's a thing where, in fact, I've got, hold that thought. So actually, I saved it. This is his marketing manual, and he had tapes and stuff too. But it's a manual that he used for his contracts and scientific data, all this kind of stuff. And so that's what Dennis he decided to try to sell those. And all of a sudden, people started sending us checks. And so the deal, I can't remember if it was the original ad said this, but what the deal quickly became, if it wasn't at the very beginning, was that it was $2,000 for a kit on either, installing or building or selling it. And for $5,000, you could get all three. And Dennis had a class, so he had a tape class, a training class, etc., train salespeople and all this kind of stuff. And in fact, all fill up boxes about like this big or so. All this material went in. And anyway, money started pouring in from around the country. And at first, so we got the first checks in. And I remember, these checks started coming in. And I was like, oh, that's okay. That's interesting. This is his next, we'll see. But I had no idea if this was the next big thing or not. And Allison didn't either. We didn't know. And all I'd seen was Bloody Room for 17 months. So I was like, okay, what is this? But anyway, so Dennis in our dining room, in our kitchen, Alice and I were going, okay, this is, we'll see what's next. Because Alice and I were like the people who made stuff happen. And it was like, Dennis was this visionary on the front of the ship. And so we were just the people we were following behind the elephant, right? And so we didn't get it. And Dennis, in fact, he did a dowser, like a he said, he goes, "This is it. I found it. I found it." And Alice and I were like, "Okay, if you say so." But I was still kind of a wait and see. I was still kind of, okay, Dennis said this is it. And did I believe it yet? I'm not sure I did. It was like, I was just like, okay, I guess so. I hope so, but I didn't know. Was Dennis ever right? So within 2 months, we went from a few employees, I mean, a few volunteers, like a handful of us, to 40 employees in like 2 months. It just went like that. Yeah, in the end, millions of dollars came in from selling these kits. And Dennis, yeah, Dennis had found his rocket ship. And that's what I'll get into next. But it was like, for me, it was like holding onto a rope tied onto a rocket that was taking off. And that's what it was like for me for the next several months. It was quite a ride. And I will get to that next. So that's all for now.